Whether they're actors, writers, or presidents, Eric Meeks has dealt with them all. He sits down with NBC Palm Springs' Steve Sumrall to recall his experiences as one of the Valley's most successful book dealers in this edition of Our Desert Past.
I'm on Tahquitz Canyon Drive in Palm Springs at a location that used to be the site of the Celebrity Bookstore. Well, recently I sat down with the owner of that business, writer Eric Meeks. Eric is a second-generation bookseller. I asked him if he could talk about his family business, and he offered me this glimpse into our desert past.
Some of the celebrities were even in the phone book. Even when I was a kid, the Fords and Bob Hope and Frank Sinatra, their phone number was right in the phone book in the 1970s. One year I called the Fords.
Local writer Eric Meeks recalls his past experience as a book dealer in Palm Springs.
In the 1990s, I had a time period where I was short of Christmas funds, and in those days I owned a bookstore downtown Palm Springs, and my dad and I were really good at going around to thrift stores and looking for books that we might be able to get autographed, and that was our business that we had in those days, or one of our businesses that we had. And I had built up probably about 50 copies of The Times of My Life by Betty Ford, which in the 1990s was already almost 20 years out of print. So I called up the phone number in the book at that point and explained myself as a book dealer in Palm Springs, and whoever picked up the phone, it wasn't Betty Ford who picked up the phone, but a staff person picked it up and said, okay, yeah, we'll ask her, we'll get back to you. Well, I never expected to get the phone call back, but a couple of weeks later, Mrs. Ford's staff called me up and said, okay, you can drop a couple of the books off at the Thunderbird gate and she'll sign them. And I was like, well, that's fantastic, but now I don't want to push and I don't want to upset the apple cart here. And I know I told you I had 50 of them a couple of weeks ago. I now have 75 and 4 Gerald Ford books, A Time to Heal. Am I pushing too much? Should I just go with the original 50 or can I drop them all off? They put the phone to their chest for a second. I could tell. Whoever on the other end was goes, they said, okay, go ahead and drop them off. And that year, the Fords signed 75 copies of A Time of My Life and 4 copies of A Time to Heal by the president. The president ones were worth $200 a copy at that time, signed. So it really helped a young man earn his Christmas money.
The former owner of Palm Springs Celebrity Bookstore recounts some celebrity sightings.
Bob Hope would go position himself at the Baskin Robbins and just have an ice cream out on the street like anybody else. My bookstore was just 5 or 6 shops down from that on the same block, and so I learned quickly to keep a selection of Bob Hope biographies in 8x10s that I could quickly sell for $10 or $20 each, because 2 or 3 times a year I'd have people come in going, Bob Hope's just down the street. Hey, what do you got? My parents were in the book business before me, starting in the 1980s. When their business started to fail, in the mid-1980s, because at that point Crown and Brentano's both came into the desert, and my parents were the local-owned book dealers that were driven out of business. My dad put a Western Union into the bookstore as a way to make some additional money. Because all you had to do was create a separate check stand and you could have a Western Union. At my parents' Western Union, at the bookstore, one of the most notorious clients that they had who would come by and get money was Tony Curtis. Because Tony a couple times went into the rehab, during those days. And sometimes he would show up to get $100. And this one time in particular, he was kind of in a rush. I think he knew he was AWOL, because while he was there, a couple of guys in white coats show up that are the nurses from there that are sent out to go retrieve the celebrities that have disappeared. Tony Curtis was literally picked up by the elbows and carried out of my parents' bookstore saying, no, I just need a few more minutes. I'm just getting a few dollars, just one more minute, and taken back to the rehab center.
But some of the most colorful characters he has crossed paths with were the writers themselves.
Harold Robbins, was, he was the A-list of A-listers in the time that I got to meet him. And my dad would deliver him his New York Times. At that point, my parents' bookstore was already down. He was the first author I really ever got as a book signer at my store. Before he did that, my dad would deliver his New York Times to him, and about every 3 or 4 months, Harold would say, what do you mean I owe you $300? I'm not paying that. Just send your kid over with a box of books and I'll sign them. I was the kid. even though I was probably 29 or 30 years old at the time, to Harold Robbins. I was a kid. And then one day I'm sitting over there at Harold's house, and he's signing books, and I look over his fireplace, and there's, to me, an obvious Picasso hanging over the fireplace, and it looks a little like Harold. And I say, I'm like, Harold, is that a Picasso? He goes, yeah. Pablo and I lived down the street from each other when we both lived in Paris, and we'd walk our dogs down the same little park. And one day Pablo stops to me and there and says, I know who you are. I'm going to paint you a picture. And he painted a portrait of Harold Robbins and then gave it to him. Harold Robbins is the only guy I ever knew who had a Picasso of himself over his fireplace. And that was here in Palm Springs.
For Our Desert Past, Steve Sumrall, NBC Palm Springs, News First.